What happens when the President of the United States pushes the limits of executive power and the Supreme Court pushes back? This week, in a dramatic turn in America's trade policy, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled against President Donald Trump's sweeping global tariff program. The decision has sparked strong reactions at home and abroad, and it has set the stage for a new chapter in the ongoing debate over presidential authority, economic nationalism, and global trade. Here's what happened and what it means next. The controversy centers around tariffs imposed by President Donald Trump during his second term in office. Earlier this year, the administration introduced broad import duties on goods from multiple countries, arguing that the measures were necessary to protect American industries and address what it described as unfair trade practices. The White House relied on emergency economic powers to justify the action. Specifically, the administration invoked statutory authority that allows a president to regulate certain economic transactions during a national emergency. According to the administration, global trade imbalances and economic vulnerabilities constituted such an emergency. However, several businesses and trade groups challenged the tariffs in court, arguing that the president had exceeded his legal authority. They contended that Congress, not the president, holds the constitutional power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. After months of legal battles, the case reached the Supreme Court of the United States. In a closely watched decision, the court ruled that the president had overstepped the limits of executive authority. The majority opinion found that while Congress has granted presidents certain powers in times of crisis, those powers are not unlimited. The court concluded that the broad, across-the-board tariffs imposed under emergency justification did not meet the statutory requirements set by law. The ruling does not eliminate all presidential trade authority. However, it makes clear that large-scale tariff programs must comply with both congressional intent and constitutional boundaries. President Trump reacted strongly. In public remarks following the ruling, he described the decision as deeply disappointing and criticized what he called judicial interference in economic policy. He argued that his administration was acting in the best interest of American workers, manufacturers, and national security. Rather than retreat, the president announced plans to pursue alternative legal avenues to continue his trade agenda. He indicated that his administration would consider other statutory authorities that allow tariff action under different frameworks. Soon after the ruling, President Trump signaled a potential increase in tariff levels, raising them to 15% under revised legal justification, though details remain subject to further administrative review and possible additional legal scrutiny. The decision has triggered reactions across global markets. Financial markets responded with volatility as investors assessed the implications of the ruling. Trade-sensitive sectors saw fluctuations amid uncertainty about what policy adjustments might follow. Economists note that tariffs can raise costs for importers and, in some cases, consumers, while potentially benefiting certain domestic producers. International leaders also responded. European officials expressed concern about escalating trade tensions but welcomed clarity from the U.S. legal system. Some governments indicated they would closely monitor whether new measures comply with international trade obligations under World Trade Organization rules. In Asia, markets showed cautious movement as exporters evaluated the potential impact of revised tariff policies. Trade experts emphasize that the ruling is significant not only economically but constitutionally. The U.S. Constitution grants Congress the authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Over time, Congress has delegated certain powers to presidents to respond quickly to economic threats or national security concerns. However, courts serve as a check to ensure those delegations are used within the boundaries set by law. Legal scholars say this case reinforces the principle of separation of powers, the foundational idea that executive authority must operate within limits defined by Congress and interpreted by the judiciary. Supporters of the president argue that strong trade measures are necessary to protect American industries from unfair competition and foreign subsidies. They contend that prior administrations have allowed trade imbalances to harm domestic manufacturing. Critics counter that broad tariffs can disrupt supply chains, increase consumer prices, and strain diplomatic relationships with key allies. At the heart of the debate is a larger question. How far can a president go in reshaping U.S. trade policy without direct congressional approval? This ruling does not settle the broader trade debate. Instead, it clarifies the legal boundaries within which that debate must occur. The administration now faces several options. It can work with Congress to pass legislation supporting revised trade measures. It can pursue more targeted tariffs under statutes explicitly tied to national security or unfair trade investigations. Or it can continue to challenge the court's interpretation through legal channels where applicable. Meanwhile, businesses are watching closely. Importers, exporters, manufacturers, and retailers depend on predictable trade rules. Sudden shifts in tariff levels can affect pricing, supply contracts, and long-term investment decisions. Economists Economists point out that global supply chains have become deeply interconnected. Changes in U.S. trade policy often have ripple effects far beyond American borders. For American consumers, the direct impact will depend on how any new tariff measures are structured and whether they target specific industries or apply more broadly. As of now, the Supreme Court's ruling stands as a significant moment in the balance of powers in Washington. It reaffirms that while presidents hold substantial authority in matters of foreign policy and national economic security, that authority operates within constitutional guardrails. For President Trump, the decision represents both a setback and a turning point. His administration's response will likely shape not only trade policy in the coming months, but also broader debates about executive power during his second term. For the country, and for global markets, the story is still unfolding. What remains certain is this: trade policy is no longer just about economics. It has become a defining arena for constitutional interpretation, political philosophy, and America's role in the global economy. And as Washington recalibrates, the world is watching. As Washington absorbs the impact of the Supreme Court's ruling, attention is now turning toward what comes next, both legally and economically. Inside the White House, advisors are reportedly reviewing alternative trade authorities that could allow the administration to continue pursuing its economic agenda. Trade policy in the United States is governed by a complex framework of laws passed over decades, and presidents historically have relied on multiple statutes when imposing tariffs. Some of those laws allow action in cases involving national security concerns. Others require investigations into unfair trade practices before duties can be applied. Each pathway carries different procedural requirements and different levels of legal vulnerability. For President Donald Trump, the ruling represents a constitutional boundary, but not necessarily the end of his broader trade strategy. In public statements, the president reiterated his long-standing view that aggressive trade enforcement is essential to protecting American jobs. He has frequently argued that previous trade agreements disadvantaged U.S. manufacturers and allowed foreign competitors to benefit unfairly from American markets. The administration's supporters in Congress echoed that sentiment. Several lawmakers stated that the president should have maximum flexibility when responding to what they describe as economic threats from abroad. Some have suggested that Congress could clarify or expand presidential trade powers through new legislation. However, passing new trade legislation would require bipartisan cooperation, something that has proven difficult in the current political climate. On Capitol Hill, reactions to the ruling have been divided along ideological lines. Some members of Congress welcomed the Supreme Court's decision as a reaffirmation of legislative authority. They argued that the Constitution clearly assigns Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations, and that broad economic measures should not be implemented without explicit congressional approval. Others warned that limiting executive flexibility could weaken the United States in fast-moving global economic disputes. The debate reflects a broader philosophical divide over how trade policy should be managed, whether through strong executive action or through negotiated multilateral frameworks shaped by Congress. Meanwhile, financial markets continue to react cautiously. Investors tend to prefer stability and predictability. The uncertainty surrounding potential new tariff measures has introduced short-term volatility in sectors heavily dependent on global supply chains, including automotive manufacturing, technology hardware, and consumer goods. Economic analysts point out that tariffs function as taxes on imported goods. While they can protect certain domestic industries, they may also increase input costs for American companies that rely on foreign components. Those increased costs can sometimes be passed along to consumers in the form of higher prices. However, the actual impact depends on the scope, duration, and structure of the tariffs. Global reaction has also been measured but watchful. European Union officials indicated that they would carefully monitor any revised U.S. trade actions to ensure compliance with international trade rules. Asian trading partners expressed similar caution, emphasizing the importance of maintaining open channels of dialogue. Diplomats note that trade disputes rarely exist in isolation. They often intersect with broader strategic relationships, including security partnerships and geopolitical negotiations. The Supreme Court ruling may also influence how future presidents approach emergency economic powers. Legal scholars suggest that the decision reinforces the judiciary's willingness to scrutinize expansive interpretations of delegated authority. The case may become a reference point in future disputes involving executive power. Historically, the balance of trade authority between Congress and the presidency has shifted over time. During periods of crisis, Congress has often granted presidents broader discretion, but courts have consistently maintained that such delegations must be grounded in clear statutory language. This latest ruling underscores that principle. For American businesses, the message is one of caution and adaptability. Companies that depend heavily on imports are reviewing contingency plans. Some are exploring alternative suppliers. Others are assessing potential pricing adjustments if new tariffs take effect under different legal authorities. Small businesses, in particular, often feel the effects of trade policy shifts more acutely as they may lack the resources to rapidly adjust supply chains. Consumer advocacy groups are also watching developments closely. They argue that trade decisions should balance economic competitiveness with affordability for American families. At the same time, labor groups representing domestic manufacturing workers continue to support stronger trade enforcement measures. They argue that tariffs can help level the playing field when foreign competitors benefit from government subsidies or lower labor standards. The administration has signaled that it remains committed to reshaping trade relationships in what it views as a more favorable direction for the United States. Whether through revised tariff structures, targeted enforcement actions, or negotiations with Congress, the White House appears determined to continue pursuing its economic objectives. As the legal dust settles, one reality is clear. This ruling has not ended the trade debate. Instead, it has elevated it from a policy disagreement to a constitutional discussion about the limits of executive authority. The coming weeks will likely determine how aggressively the administration moves forward and whether additional legal challenges emerge. For now, the Supreme Court's decision stands as a defining moment, a reminder that even in areas as politically charged as trade, the constitutional system of checks and balances remains firmly in place. And as policymakers weigh their next steps, businesses, markets, and international partners will continue watching closely, aware that U.S. trade policy does not just affect America, but the global economy as a whole. Beyond the immediate political reaction, the Supreme Court's ruling has prompted deeper discussion about the structure of American governance itself. At its core, this case is not only about tariffs, it is about how power is divided in the United States government, and how that balance is tested during moments of economic uncertainty. The framers of the Constitution deliberately separated powers among three branches: legislative, executive, and judicial. Congress writes the laws. The president executes them. The courts interpret them. In matters of international trade, Congress holds explicit authority under Article 1 of the Constitution to regulate commerce with foreign nations. Over the decades, however, Congress has delegated certain powers to presidents so they can respond quickly to national emergencies, unfair trade practices, or national security threats. The key legal question in this case was whether the administration's tariff program fell within those delegated powers or went beyond them. The Supreme Court of the United States ultimately concluded that the emergency justification used to impose broad global tariffs did not meet the statutory requirements defined by Congress. Legal analysts say this decision may influence how future administrations frame economic emergencies. Courts may require more specific findings and clearer connections between the emergency cited and the economic measures imposed. In practical terms, that means future presidents could face higher legal hurdles when attempting sweeping economic actions under emergency authority. For President Donald Trump, the ruling presents both political challenges and strategic opportunities. On one hand, it limits the scope of unilateral executive action. On the other, it allows the president to frame the issue as a broader fight over economic sovereignty and judicial oversight, themes that resonate strongly with segments of his political base. Political strategists note that trade policy has long been a defining issue in President Trump's political identity. From his first campaign through his second term, he has consistently emphasized renegotiating trade agreements, confronting trade deficits, and prioritizing domestic production. The current dispute reinforces that narrative, placing trade policy once again at the center of national political conversation. In the business community, reactions remain measured. Major trade associations have stated that they respect the court's decision and value clarity in trade rules. Many companies prefer stable, predictable frameworks that allow long-term planning. Sudden shift, whether imposing tariffs or removing them, can disrupt contracts, investment strategies, and supply chains. Technology companies, automotive manufacturers, and retail importers are particularly sensitive to tariff policy. Many rely on global sourcing networks that span multiple continents. Even modest changes in tariff rates can alter pricing structures and profit margins. At the same time, domestic producers in certain industries have expressed continued support for strong trade enforcement. They argue that foreign competitors sometimes benefit from government subsidies, lower regulatory standards, or currency advantages that distort fair competition. This divergence highlights the complexity of trade policy. It rarely benefits all sectors equally. Instead, it often redistributes economic pressures across industries. Economists caution against oversimplifying the impact of tariffs. While they can provide short-term relief to specific industries, they can also invite retaliatory measures from trading partners. When retaliation occurs, It may target unrelated sectors, expanding the economic ripple effects. Historically, trade disputes have sometimes led to negotiated settlements rather than prolonged escalation. Diplomatic engagement often accompanies economic measures, even when rhetoric appears confrontational. International observers are watching carefully for signs of whether the United States will seek new negotiations or double down on revised tariff strategies. Some foreign governments have signaled openness to dialogue, emphasizing that long-term economic growth depends on cooperative trade relationships. Others have prepared contingency measures in case new tariffs are implemented under different legal authorities. The World Trade Organization framework remains relevant in this context. If disputes arise regarding compliance with global trade rules, affected nations could pursue formal complaints through established dispute resolution channels. For American households, the immediate effect remains uncertain. While markets reacted to the news, consumer prices typically adjust gradually depending on how companies respond and whether revised tariffs are implemented. Inflation remains a broader economic concern, and policymakers are aware that trade measures can intersect with monetary policy, supply chain stability, and consumer confidence. The coming months may bring additional clarity. If the administration introduces revised tariffs under alternative legal statutes, those measures could face further judicial review. Courts may examine whether the new approach aligns more closely with congressional intent. Alternatively, Congress itself could step in, either to support expanded trade authority or to reassert legislative control more explicitly. Regardless of the outcome, this episode underscores a recurring theme in American governance. Policy debates often become constitutional debates. Trade policy, once viewed primarily as an economic matter, now intersects with questions about executive power, judicial oversight, and the evolving interpretation of statutory authority. For voters, the issue may influence broader perceptions of leadership and governance. Supporters may view strong executive trade action as decisive and protective of national interests. Critics may view judicial restraint as necessary to preserve constitutional balance. Both perspectives reflect deeply rooted traditions within American political thought. As the administration considers its next steps, the broader global economy remains interconnected and sensitive to signals from Washington. Financial markets, foreign capitals, and American businesses will continue analyzing every statement, policy adjustment, and legal filing. The Supreme Court's decision may have closed one chapter, but it has clearly opened another. Trade policy remains at the center of economic strategy, political identity, and constitutional interpretation in the United States. And in the world of global commerce, where trillions of dollars move across borders each year, even a single court ruling can reshape expectations far beyond America's shores. The story is still unfolding, and its long-term consequences will depend on how policymakers respond in the days and weeks ahead. As legal experts continue analyzing the Supreme Court's ruling, another important question is emerging: how will this decision shape the long-term relationship between economic policy and executive authority in the United States? Trade authority has evolved significantly over the last century. In earlier decades, Congress exercised tighter control over tariff levels, but as global trade expanded and international agreements became more complex, lawmakers increasingly delegated limited powers to the executive branch to respond quickly to changing conditions. Those delegations were never meant to be unlimited. Instead, they were designed to give presidents flexibility while preserving Congress's constitutional authority over commerce. The recent ruling reinforces that balance. Constitutional scholars note that the judiciary's role is not to determine whether tariffs are good or bad economic policy. Rather, its role is to determine whether the president acted within the boundaries set by law. In this case, the court determined that the legal justification offered for sweeping global tariffs exceeded what Congress authorized under emergency statutes. That conclusion may encourage future administrations, regardless of political party, to draft more narrowly tailored trade measures, supported by detailed findings and clear statutory alignment. For President Donald Trump, the decision is unfolding during a politically significant period of his second term. Trade enforcement has long been one of the pillars of his policy agenda. From renegotiating trade agreements to implementing tariffs aimed at reducing trade deficits, his approach has consistently emphasized economic nationalism and domestic manufacturing. Supporters argue that this strategy has reshaped global trade discussions and pressured foreign governments to reconsider certain policies. Critics counter that unilateral tariff actions can increase domestic costs and strain alliances. Now, with the Supreme Court's ruling in place, the administration's next moves will likely be scrutinized even more closely. One possible path forward involves narrower, country-specific tariffs tied to formal investigations of unfair trade practices. Such investigations typically require evidence gathering, public comment periods, and structured agency review before action is taken. Another possibility involves working directly with Congress to codify elements of the trade agenda into law. However, legislative negotiations can be lengthy and politically complex. Meanwhile, economic forecasters are carefully modeling potential outcomes. If revised tariffs are implemented under alternative legal authorities, the magnitude and duration of those measures will determine their economic impact. Economists emphasize that tariffs can have both protective and inflationary effects, depending on how industries and consumers respond. For example, domestic producers competing with imported goods may benefit from reduced foreign competition. At the same time, companies relying on imported components may face higher input costs. The net economic effect often depends on the specific industries targeted and the elasticity of supply chains. Financial institutions have noted that clarity, more than any specific tariff level, is often the most important factor for markets. Investors can adapt to policy shifts when they understand the rules of engagement. Uncertainty, however, can dampen investment and delay expansion decisions. Global trade partners are also adjusting their expectations. Diplomatic channels remain active. Even amid legal disputes and political rhetoric, governments frequently engage in behind-the-scenes negotiations to avoid escalation. Trade disputes historically have led to a mix of formal complaints, quiet diplomacy, and eventual compromise. Whether this situation follows that pattern remains to be seen. Another dimension of this case involves how it may influence emergency powers more broadly. Legal experts observe that economic emergencies differ from traditional national security crises. Courts may require more concrete evidence of immediate harm when economic measures are justified under emergency authority. This distinction could have ripple effects beyond trade policy, potentially shaping how future administrations approach sanctions, financial restrictions, or cross-border economic controls. For the American public, the constitutional framework at work here represents a core feature of democratic governance. The system of checks and balances is designed to ensure that major policy decisions, especially those with nationwide impact, are grounded in lawful authority. While policy disagreements are common, the resolution of those disagreements through legal channels reflects institutional stability. In the coming weeks, policymakers, businesses, and international observers will be watching for specific administrative actions. Will the administration announce revised tariffs under different statutory authority? Will Congress intervene to clarify trade powers? Will additional lawsuits follow? Each of these possibilities carries distinct implications for the economy and for the balance of governmental authority. What remains clear is that trade policy is no longer confined to technical economic debates. It has become intertwined with constitutional interpretation, political identity, and America's evolving role in global markets. The Supreme Court's ruling marks a significant moment in that ongoing story. It underscores that even the most consequential economic strategies must operate within legal frameworks defined by Congress and interpreted by the judiciary. For President Trump, the challenge now lies in advancing his trade objectives within those clarified boundaries. For lawmakers, the decision invites reflection on whether existing statutes adequately define executive authority in the modern global economy. And for the global community, the episode serves as a reminder that U.S. policy decisions, whether executive actions or judicial rulings, can have ripple effects across continents. As the administration considers its next move, the world continues to watch. The debate over tariffs, executive authority, and economic sovereignty is far from over. In fact, it may be entering a new and more constitutionally defined phase, one that will shape American trade policy for years to come.